I'm 47 years old, and for the last 6 years, I've carried knowledge that makes every conversation about the ocean feel like a performance. I'm a marine biologist. I study ecosystems, migration patterns, species distribution. I speak the language of peer review and data sets. But none of that prepared me for what I saw pulled from the shallows off the coast of northern Scotland in 2018. The people who found it weren't scientists. They were commercial fishermen working a remote inlet at dawn, and what came up in their net wasn't supposed to exist. Not in mythology, not in evolutionary theory, not in any framework we use to understand life on this planet. They held it for 4 hours before releasing it back into the water. During those 4 hours, it watched them. It responded to them, and according to their account, an account I've spent 6 years trying to rationalize, dismiss, or forget, it showed them things about the ocean that we've never documented, never theorized, never even imagined. I won't ask you to believe what they reported. I'm just going to walk you through what they observed, what we know about deep-sea biology that makes their observations disturbingly plausible, and why their story has haunted me ever since I first read the deposition they filed with the UK Marine Management Organization. This is their account. This is what they saw. This is what it revealed. Every maritime culture on Earth has imagined something human living in the water. The Assyrians worshipped a Targatas around 1000 BC, a goddess who transformed her lower body into a fish after killing her human lover. The Greeks told stories of sirens, originally bird women who evolved in retellings into fish-tailed singers luring sailors onto rocks. In Japan, the Ningyo was depicted not as beautiful, but grotesque, a creature with a human face grafted onto a fish body, an omen of storms, its flesh rumored to grant unnatural longevity if consumed. The African Mamiwata traditions describe powerful water spirits taking mermaid form, beings of fortune and destruction, embodying the ocean's dual nature, benevolent and lethal, beautiful and alien. These aren't variations on a European fairy tale. They're independent mythologies separated by thousands of miles and centuries, all converging on the same impossible image, something that is us but isn't, something that lives where we cannot. For modern science, the explanation has always been simple: misidentification, pattern recognition, misfiring under stress. Christopher Columbus reported seeing 3 mermaids off Hispaniola in 1493. He noted in his log that they were not as beautiful as they are painted and had masculine traits in their faces. He saw manatees, sailors isolated at sea for months, desperate for any sign of the familiar, imposed human features onto marine mammals glimpsed at distance. The brain does this, we know it does this. Then there's the aquatic ape hypothesis. Fringe science, rejected by mainstream evolutionary biology, but persistent. Elaine Morgan proposed it in the 1970s. Human ancestors went through an aquatic or semi-aquatic phase, which would explain our bipedalism, our subcutaneous fat, our hairlessness, our breath control, features that make no sense for savanna primates, but perfect sense for shallow water waders. It's not accepted, but it asks the right question. If evolutionary pressure pushed one branch of primates toward the water, what stopped it from pushing another branch all the way in? The account that reached me in 2018 doesn't fit the usual pattern. This wasn't a sailor's glimpse of a distant shape. It wasn't a blurry photograph or a tale passed down through generations until the details smoothed into legend. This was a capture, a prolonged encounter, multiple witnesses. Physical proximity measured in feet, not miles. They didn't see a beautiful woman with a shimmering tail. They didn't see a manatee or a seal or a trick of light on water. They saw something with human anatomy warped by an environment that should have been incompatible with human survival. They saw deep-sea adaptations written into a form that resembled us, just enough to trigger every primal alarm our species carries about the uncanny. And when they looked into its eyes, black, lidless, unblinking, it looked back with an intelligence they couldn't categorize but couldn't deny. This is where the story begins, not in myth, not in misidentification, in a fishing net at dawn, with something impossible struggling against the nylon mesh, and 4 men realizing they had crossed a threshold they couldn't uncross. I was a marine biology graduate student when I heard the account. The witnesses were coastal surveyors working a stretch of uninhabited shoreline in the Pacific Northwest. The kind of place where the nearest road ends 3 miles back and the tide pools remain untouched for months at a time. They'd been documenting erosion patterns following an unusual king tide sequence in late September. The tides had been wrong all week, water pulling back farther than the charts predicted, exposing sections of seabed that typically remained submerged. They found it in a tidal basin at dawn. The first thing they noticed was the smell, not rotting fish, but something mineral and sharp like ozone after lightning. Then the sound, a rhythmic clicking that seemed to come from the rocks themselves, felt as vibration before it registered as noise. One of them thought it was a trapped seal, another assumed debris caught in a crevice. They approached with cameras already recording, expecting to document wildlife in distress. What they found was neither. The creature was approximately 4 feet in length, coiled in 18 inches of residual seawater between 2 barnacle-covered formations. Its skin was the color of deep ocean twilight, that blue-gray translucence found in creatures that never see sunlight. Not scales, not mammalian hide. Something closer to the membrane of a jellyfish, stretched over a skeletal structure that suggested both human and something fundamentally other. The head was proportionally large, the skull shape wrong in ways they struggled to articulate in their account. The eyes dominated the face, black, wet, and enormous, with no visible whites, no iris differentiation. Lidless, adapted for an environment where every photon of bioluminescent light mattered. The kind of eyes you see in deep-sea predators that hunt in permanent midnight. But it was the hands that stopped them. Long, thin fingers, 7 on each appendage, extending from what could only be called wrists. Each digit webbed to the base with translucent tissue, shot through with a network of dark veins visible beneath the surface. The fingers ended not in fingernails, but in hard, pale points of cartilage that resembled the beaks of cephalopods, designed for gripping in current, for manipulating objects, in an environment of pressure and cold. Along its ribs, membranes pulsed with visible contraction, not gills in the traditional sense, but respiratory structures that drew oxygen from water through direct diffusion. The witnesses noted bioluminescent nodes scattered across its torso, in no pattern they recognized, dim in the morning light, but present. Organs of communication, perhaps, or predation. It made no sound when it saw them. The clicking stopped. The creature's body went completely still, only the respiratory membranes continuing their rhythmic expansion and collapse. But the eyes tracked, followed each of them as they moved, assessed. There was no panic in its posture, no thrashing attempt at escape, just observation. One of the surveyors later described the moment as inverted, the feeling of being the specimen, not the scientist. They made the decision in less than 2 minutes. The tide was coming back. The creature was clearly not built for air exposure. The membranes were already showing stress, the skin beginning to dull where it had dried. They had a portable tank used for collecting samples, 40 gallons, filled with seawater, pumped from the adjacent basin. If they didn't act, it would either escape back into the ocean or die on the rocks. They moved carefully, expecting resistance. The creature offered none. As they maneuvered the netting beneath its body, it remained motionless, watching the operation with those massive black eyes. When they lifted it from the tidal pool, the weight was wrong, too light for its size, as though its bones were hollow or filled with gas bladders for buoyancy control. Deep-sea fish often have reduced skeletal mass. adaptations for environments where gravity functions differently under crushing pressure. They transported it in the tank to their research station, a prefabricated shelter 200 yards inland. The entire time, it maintained that same unnerving stillness, suspended in the center of the container, rotating slowly to keep all of them in its visual field. When they sealed the tank and finally stepped back to assess what they'd captured, one of the witnesses recorded a single sentence in her field notes. "It's not studying us like an animal. It's studying us like a scientist." The first attempt at communication happened 3 hours later. The creature had been motionless since containment, hovering in the tank's center, those massive eyes fixed on the surveyors as they photographed it from every angle and took water samples from the container. They noted the water temperature had dropped 4 degrees despite the ambient room warmth. The creature seemed to be regulating its environment, drawing heat from the surrounding liquid. Then the bioluminescent nodes began to pulse, not randomly, in sequences, patterns of light rippling across its torso in waves that started at the base of the skull and traveled down to where its body tapered into what could only be described as a powerful, muscular tail. The patterns repeated, changed, intensified. One of the witnesses was a recreational diver with experience photographing cuttlefish. She recognized the behavior immediately. Chromatophore communication, the rapid-fire color changing used by cephalopods to signal intent, emotion, territory. But cuttlefish patterns were instinctive, reactive. These patterns felt deliberate. The creature maintained eye contact with her specifically as the light show continued, the bioluminescence shifting from blue to pale green to something almost ultraviolet at the edges of human perception. The rhythm matched nothing in their field guides, didn't correspond to distress signals or mating displays documented in any known marine species. Then it stopped, went dark, and waited, like it expected a response. The witnesses were not trained xenobiologists. They were coastal surveyors with bachelor's degrees in environmental science and a working knowledge of regional marine life. But even they understood that what they'd contained in that 40-gallon tank shouldn't exist, according to every textbook definition of evolutionary possibility. The problem wasn't that the creature was strange. The problem was that every strange feature had a precedent in documented deep-sea biology. It looked like something that had evolved in the abyss and then developed intelligence. The eyes were the first feature they tried to rationalize. In their account, they estimated each eye at roughly 3 inches in diameter, disproportionately massive compared to the creature's 4-foot frame, completely black, with no visible pupil or iris structure, just a wet, reflective surface that seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it. No eyelids, no nictitating membrane, just constant, unblinking observation. The adaptation is common below 1,000 meters. In the ocean's twilight zone and beyond, where sunlight penetrates as barely detectable blue, wavelengths before vanishing entirely, eye size becomes a matter of survival. Creatures like the vampire squid possess the largest eye-to-body ratio of any animal on Earth, massive spherical organs designed to capture every available photon of bioluminescent light produced by prey, predators, and potential mates. The deep-sea hatchetfish has tubular eyes aimed permanently upward, scanning for the silhouettes of food against the faint surface glow. If an intelligent species evolved in that lightless environment, eyes like the creature's wouldn't just be likely, they'd be mandatory. The skin presented a different kind of disturbing plausibility. The surveyors described it as translucent, not transparent, but thin enough that the dark network of veins and what appeared to be musculature were visible beneath the surface, like looking at anatomical structures through frosted glass. Pale blue-gray in color, with no pigmentation variation across the body, no freckles, no mottling, no discoloration, uniform and bloodless in appearance. Again, the deep ocean provides the template. Creatures that live beyond the reach of ultraviolet radiation have no evolutionary pressure to develop melanin or protective pigmentation. Many abyssal species are either pure white or completely transparent. Glass squid, barrel eye fish, translucent sea cucumbers that look like living gelatin. Pigment serves no purpose in an environment without light. The energy cost of producing it would be wasted biology. But the creature's skin had one feature that moved it beyond passive adaptation into active functionality. Embedded across its torso, concentrated along the ribs and shoulders, were dozens of small bioluminescent photophores, organic light-producing organs no larger than a pencil eraser. In the dim light of the research station, they appeared as faint nodes beneath the skin. Under stress or apparent communication attempts, they activated, producing pulses of blue-green light that rippled across the creature's body in coordinated waves. Bioluminescence is not an anomaly in the deep ocean, it's the standard. Researchers estimate that up to 90% of deep-sea organisms produce light through chemical reactions involving luciferin and luciferase enzymes. They use it for camouflage, counter-illumination to match faint downwelling light and erase their shadows. They use it for predation, dangling glowing lures like the anglerfish. And they use it for communication, flashing patterns to attract mates, ward off rivals, or coordinate hunting behavior in species that travel in bioluminescent clouds. The Hawaiian bobtail squid controls colonies of bioluminescent bacteria in specialized light organs, adjusting their glow to match moonlight and become invisible to predators below. Comb jellies produce waves of rainbow light along their cilia. Certain species of ostracod crustaceans create bioluminescent clouds as defensive smokescreens. If the creature in the ether tank was using light to communicate, it was doing exactly what countless other deep-sea species do every night in the abyssal plains. The hands disturbed them most. 7 fingers on each appendage, each roughly 4 inches long and webbed to the second knuckle with translucent tissue reinforced by thin cartilage supports. The webbing allowed the entire hand to function as a single paddle for propulsion, but the fingers retained independent articulation. The witnesses observed the creature manipulating objects they introduced to the tank, gripping and rotating a waterproof flashlight with startling dexterity. The fingers ended in hard, keratinized points, not claws, not nails, structures more similar to the beaks of squid and octopi, pale, slightly curved, and sharp enough to leave scratches on the acrylic tank wall when the creature pressed against it. Deep-sea octopi have been documented using their arms and suckers to manipulate tools, open containers, and solve complex puzzles in laboratory settings. The coconut octopus carries shell halves across the ocean floor and assembles them into protective shelters. Intelligence and manipulative appendages evolve together. One enables the other. But it was the respiratory system that confirmed the creature's origin in high-pressure environments. No gills in the traditional fish sense, no external slits or feathery structures. Instead, the witnesses documented a series of thin, translucent membranes running along both sides of the rib cage, pulsing rhythmically, even when the creature was motionless. Oxygen extraction through direct diffusion across a maximized surface area, the same mechanism used by sea cucumbers and certain deep-sea worms that lack complex respiratory organs. At extreme depths, where pressure reaches hundreds of atmospheres, traditional lung or gill structures become liabilities. Rigid air-filled cavities collapse. Complex organ systems require too much energy to maintain. Evolution favors simplicity, permeable membranes, slow metabolisms, bodies adapted to function in cold, oxygen-poor water. The creature's body temperature registered 4 degrees below the ambient seawater temperature when they finally measured it. Cold-blooded didn't adequately describe it. Its metabolism appeared calibrated for near-freezing water, the kind found in the Hadal zone below 6,000 meters, where the ocean floor descends into trenches that remain colder than most laboratory freezers. Warm surface water was likely hostile to it, possibly even painful, yet it survived in the tank for 17 hours. The witnesses noted that it never slept, never stopped watching them, and never displayed what they recognized as distress beyond the initial membrane stress from air exposure. It hovered, it observed, and every few hours it attempted that same bioluminescent communication sequence, patterns of light scrolling across its skin in repetitions that felt less like instinct and more like language. One surveyor later described the experience as looking at a deep-sea predator that had somehow bootstrapped itself into sentience. Every feature could be explained. Every adaptation had a documented parallel in known marine biology. The horror wasn't in the impossibility of the creature. The horror was in its plausibility. They made the decision in less than 2 minutes. According to the account, the group stood in the shallows and debated what no one should have to decide, whether to secure a creature that shouldn't exist for observation or let it return to depths where it could never be found again. They chose captivity. They chose to cross a line that exists precisely because of moments like this. The makeshift holding area was a tidal pool they reinforced with netting and rocks. Nothing elaborate, nothing that suggested they'd planned for this. They described working in near silence, hands shaking as they guided the creature into the enclosure, half expecting it to thrash or cry out, or display some recognizable animal panic. It did none of those things. The creature moved with them. It allowed itself to be transferred. Its massive black eyes tracked each person with what the witnesses described as clinical observation, the gaze of a researcher watching test subjects, not prey assessing predators. That inversion of expectation unsettled them more than aggression would have. One witness later said the creature's cooperation felt like consent, as if it understood what they were doing and had decided to permit it. Another disagreed. They said it felt like indifference, the way a whale might barely register the presence of fish swimming near its eye. Neither interpretation offered comfort. They documented its behavior in those first hours with obsessive detail, perhaps trying to justify the choice through scientific rigor. The creature remained near the bottom of the pool, its translucent skin shifting through subtle color, changes they couldn't interpret. Bioluminescent patterns pulsed along its ribs and down its arms in sequences that seemed too regular to be autonomic responses. It barely moved. For long stretches, it simply watched them watching it. The psychological weight appeared in their account not as dramatic crisis, but as accumulating discomfort. They'd created a power dynamic where they held physical control, but the creature's calm, measuring attention made them feel like the observed rather than the observers. Every time they approached the pool's edge, those lidless eyes tracked the movement with perfect precision. One witness described checking on it near midnight. The creature hung motionless in the water, its gaze fixed on the shore. When the witness stepped into view, the eyes shifted to meet theirs instantly, with no startled reaction, no delay in recognition. It had known they were there before they appeared. The witness left without approaching closer. The ethical dimensions of their situation crystallized slowly. They justified the capture as documentation of an impossible discovery, but documentation for whom? They had no institutional affiliation, no protocol for this scenario, no framework beyond their own judgment. They were simply people who'd stumbled into contact with something beyond categorization and decided their curiosity outweighed its autonomy. The creature never tested the barriers, never attempted escape. That stillness became more disturbing than struggle would have been. It suggested either complete resignation or complete confidence, and neither possibility aligned with their assumption of control. By the second day, one member of the group began arguing for immediate release. The creature hadn't eaten. They'd tried offering fish, which it ignored without even appearing to register, and its respiratory membranes showed signs of stress, the pulsing rhythm slightly irregular. But others insisted they needed more time, more observation, more proof. The decision to hold an intelligent being against its will erodes differently than other ethical violations. It doesn't announce itself as cruelty. It presents as temporary necessity, as unique circumstances, as responsibility to larger truth. The witness's account included these rationalizations almost verbatim, then acknowledged them as exactly that, the language people use when they know what they're doing is wrong, but haven't yet found the will to stop. What shifted the dynamic wasn't guilt, it was recognition. On the third day, the creature began producing sounds, not the sonar clicks they'd documented earlier, but something lower, felt more than heard. The vibrations traveled through the ground, through the water, through bone. Several witnesses reported the same physical sensation, pressure behind the eyes, a frequency that made their teeth ache. Then, the bioluminescent patterns changed. Instead of irregular pulses, the lights began moving in. Deliberate sequences across its skin, running down its arms, spreading across its torso, illuminating its face in cascading waves. The complexity was undeniable. This wasn't autonomic response. This was language. One witness described it as watching someone trying to communicate across an impossible gap, using the only tools available. The creature was attempting to speak to them, not with human language, not with sound they could process as words, but with light and vibration and patterns their brains struggled to interpret. And they realized they were holding something that wanted to tell them things they had no capacity to understand. The communication didn't happen in words. The witnesses were consistent on that point. What they experienced was something closer to sensation, impressions that bypassed language entirely and manifested as physical feeling, as fragmentary images, as knowledge that appeared in their minds without the scaffolding of grammar or syntax. The creature's bioluminescence became the primary medium. The lights rippling across its skin followed patterns too complex and too rapid for conscious tracking, but several witnesses reported perceiving meaning anyway, the way you might understand a facial expression without analyzing the specific muscle movements that create it. Marine biology offers a framework for this. Cuttlefish communicate through chromatophores, specialized cells that expand and contract to create color changes across their skin. They can display multiple patterns simultaneously on different parts of their bodies, essentially holding several conversations at once. The neural control required for that kind of communication operates on a level utterly foreign to vocal species. If something had evolved similar capabilities at human-scale intelligence, the complexity would exceed anything in our reference range. The creature's skin held thousands of bioluminescent cells, each capable of independent control, creating cascading patterns that could convey layered information, the way our language stacks words into sentences, into paragraphs. But light was only one component. The vibrations it produced operated below the threshold of hearing, but well within the range of physical perception. Whales and dolphins use infrasound and ultrasound for long-distance communication, producing frequencies that travel through water for hundreds of miles. The witnesses described feeling these vibrations in their chests, in their skulls, in the soft tissue behind their eyes. One witness said it felt like memory surfacing, except the memories weren't theirs. Another described it as dreaming while awake. A third simply said they knew things they hadn't known before, without any clear moment of transition between ignorance and understanding. The content of these impressions centered on environment and perception. The creature seemed to be trying to convey what its world was like, using the only bridge available, direct sensation rather than symbolic description, pressure. That came through most clearly. The witnesses reported a crushing weight settling over them during these exchanges, Not painful, but totalizing, as if their bodies suddenly remembered what it meant to exist under miles of water. The sensation lasted only seconds, but left them breathless and disoriented. Darkness followed. Not the darkness of closing your eyes, but absolute absence of light as a permanent condition. Several witnesses described this as the most difficult impression to process. Their brains kept trying to fill the void with phantom images, visual noise generated by a system evolved to expect light. But the creature existed in an environment where that expectation would be fatal, where light meant bioluminescence, meant communication or luring or warning, never passive illumination. Then sound. Not as humans process it, but as dimensional information, the creature appeared to perceive its environment through reflected vibration, building a sonic map of space the way bats and dolphins do. One witness described receiving a fragmented impression of sensing a reef structure, not by seeing it, but by feeling the shape of silence it created, the way sound bent around its mass. This wasn't metaphor. This was the creature attempting to describe its sensory reality to beings whose entire perceptual framework was incompatible. The most unsettling impressions involved scale and depth. Multiple witnesses reported moments of vertigo, a feeling suddenly insignificant against vast distances that had nothing to do with horizontal space. One described it as looking up at the night sky, except the stars were below instead of above, scattered across crushing depths where pressure would liquefy human tissue in seconds. Another impression recurred across witness accounts: colonies, not cities in any architectural sense, but massive biological aggregations clustered around heat sources. The witnesses struggled to articulate this. They used words like hive and reef and network, then rejected each term as inadequate. What they seemed to be describing was communal living on a scale that blurred the line between settlement and organism. The creature's communication carried no obvious emotion. The witnesses noted this specifically. There was no anger at captivity, no fear, no plea for release. Just information, transmitted with something approaching clinical detachment. It showed them its world the way you might describe your hometown to a foreigner, matter-of-factly, without expectation that the description would generate any particular response. But underneath that detachment, several witnesses reported sensing something else, not emotion exactly, more like perspective, the impression that they were being evaluated just as carefully as they were evaluating it, that their attempts to understand were themselves being studied and cataloged. One witness described a moment of sudden clarity during these exchanges. They realized the creature wasn't trying to communicate with them specifically. It was demonstrating communication itself, showing them it possessed complex language, abstract thought, intentional information transfer. It was proving intelligence to beings it had already determined were intelligent enough to recognize the proof. This realization inverted the entire dynamic. They weren't researchers documenting an animal. They were participants in first contact between two species with nothing in common except consciousness and the capacity to recognize it in each other. The creature watched their faces during these exchanges. Its massive eyes tracked subtle expressions, pupil responses, the unconscious physical reactions that accompany comprehension or confusion. It was reading them, adjusting its attempts based on what worked and what didn't. On the third night, the communication reached its most intense point. The bioluminescent patterns accelerated, the vibrations deepened, and multiple witnesses reported receiving the same core impression simultaneously. Heat rising from below, from the planet itself, sustaining entire ecosystems in total darkness. Life powered not by the sun, but by Earth's core. Then the creature went still. The lights faded, the vibrations stopped. It had told them what it came to tell them. Now it was simply waiting. They asked me to describe what the creature revealed about the ocean. I can't. Not because I'm unwilling, Because the information, if that's even the right word, didn't arrive as language, it came as pressure against my skull, as fragments of sensory experience I have no organs to process. As understanding that bypassed explanation entirely, but I'll try. The first thing it showed us was darkness. Not the absence of light, but darkness as a fundamental state. Darkness with texture and weight. Darkness that carries information the way air carries, sound. In that darkness, the creature existed not by seeing, but by feeling. Pressure changes rippling across specialized organs along its flanks, sonic vibrations painting three-dimensional maps of its surroundings, electromagnetic fields generated by living tissue, creating signatures as distinct as faces. We experience the ocean as a place where light fades. The creature experienced our shallow waters as a place where useful sensation is drowned out by the chaos of photons. The second fragment was heat, not warmth, heat as a source, as the foundation of everything. The images that came were of massive geological structures on the ocean floor, fissures in the planet's crust, leaking superheated mineral-rich water into the freezing abyss. Around these thermal vents, the creature showed us ecosystems that had nothing to do with the sun. Chemosynthetic bacteria processing sulfur compounds and methane. Tube worms with blood that binds to hydrogen sulfide instead of oxygen. Blind crabs harvesting bacterial mats with specialized claws. This matched our own discoveries from the late 1970s, the Galapagos rift vents, the entire recalibration of what we thought necessary for life. But the creature's version showed scale we haven't documented. Vent fields stretching for kilometers. Biological structures, I hesitate to call them colonies, organized in patterns that suggested intentional architecture. The third element was stranger. The creature communicated a world of vertical migration on a scale that dwarfed surface ecosystems. Every night, it suggested, the largest animal migration on Earth occurs when deep-sea organisms rise toward the surface to feed, then descend before dawn. Trillions of tons of biomass moving through kilometers of water column in a daily rhythm that goes almost entirely unobserved by humans. This is verifiable. It's called the deep scattering layer, detected by sonar operators who initially thought it was the seafloor itself, until it moved. But the creature's version showed intelligence embedded in that migration, coordination, patterns of movement that responded to more than simple hunger. The fourth fragment disturbed us most. The creature showed us sound as a physical medium, not metaphorically, literally. In the deep ocean, low-frequency vibrations can travel for hundreds of miles through water with minimal degradation. Whale songs crossing entire ocean basins, seismic activity from tectonic plates, grinding against each other, the hum of geothermal activity. The creature suggested these sounds weren't random noise. They were communication, information exchange across distances that made our concept of isolated populations meaningless. It showed us sonar clicks and vibrations forming patterns, complex, structured, repeated, a sonic web connecting vast portions of the ocean floor we've never mapped. This part I can partially support with research. Cetacean communication studies have documented sophisticated syntax in humpback whale songs. We've recorded sperm whales using distinct dialects across different pods. We know dolphin signature whistles function as individual names. The science supports the existence of complex acoustic communication we're only beginning to decode. But the creature's version suggested something more organized, something closer to language than song. The final piece wasn't visual or sonic. It was conceptual, delivered as pure understanding without sensory component. The creature communicated depth, not just physical distance from the surface, but depth as an entirely separate realm with its own physics. Water pressure increasing by 1 atmosphere every 10 meters. the bathypelagic zone beginning at 1,000 meters, the abyssopelagic at 4,000. The Hadal zone, the deepest trenches, extending past 6,000 meters, deeper than Everest, is tall. In those depths, the creature showed us, everything operates differently. Proteins fold into configurations impossible at surface pressure. Bone density increases. Cellular membranes incorporate different lipid structures. Bioluminescence becomes the primary visual language because, even if sunlight could penetrate that far, there isn't enough to see by. The creature existed in a world where the crushing pressure that would liquefy human tissue is normal, where temperatures hover just above freezing except near thermal vents, where superheated water reaches 400 degrees Celsius but doesn't boil because of the immense pressure, where oxygen concentrations are a fraction of surface levels, and most metabolism operates at radically slower rates. This is all confirmable science. We have submersibles and remote vehicles that have documented these conditions. We have tissue samples from deep-sea organisms showing exactly these adaptations. We know the Mariana Trench reaches nearly 11,000 meters. We know amphipods and snailfish survive there with cellular structures we're still studying. But here's what unsettled us. The creature communicated all of this not as hostile environment, but as home. Not as barely survivable extremes, but as optimal conditions. It showed us a biosphere as rich and complex as any rainforest, hidden under pressure that makes exploration almost impossible. When it finished, when the fragmentary images and pressure sensations stopped, one impression remained. The creature wanted us to understand that the shallow coastal waters where we found it were the extremes, the crushing pressure of sunlight, the thin, oxygen-saturated water, the chaotic thermal variations. It was a visitor in our world. We were the ones living in the inhospitable zone. I've spent years since trying to verify pieces of what we experienced. 80% of our ocean remains unmapped. The deepest portions are visited less frequently than the surface of the moon. We've cataloged perhaps 10% of marine species. Every deep-sea expedition discovers organisms that rewrite what we thought we knew. About biology, the creature's revelations weren't prophecies or warnings. They were descriptions of verified reality in places we simply haven't looked closely enough. That's what made them so difficult to dismiss. I need to explain what happened after the creature left. We had no physical evidence, no tissue samples, no photographs clear enough to withstand scrutiny, no recordings that captured anything but distorted static. What we had were memories of impossible biology and fragments of communicated information that shouldn't have made sense. Then I started researching in earnest. Not to prove what we'd seen, I knew what we'd seen, but to understand how much of what the creature showed us was already documented in scientific literature we'd simply never encountered. The answer was most of it. Start with the foundation, hydrothermal vents. Until 1977, we believed all life on Earth ultimately depended on photosynthesis. The sun was the non-negotiable starting point for every food chain. Then the deep-sea submersible Alvin descended to the Galapagos Rift and discovered ecosystems thriving in absolute darkness, powered entirely by chemicals spewing from cracks in the Earth's crust. Chemosynthetic bacteria convert hydrogen sulfide and methane into usable energy. Tube worms, Riftia pachyptila, grow to 8 feet long with no mouth or digestive system, hosting bacterial colonies in specialized organs that feed them directly. Yeti crabs farm sulfur bacteria on their own body hair. Vent shrimp have light-sensing organs on their backs to detect the faint glow of superheated water to avoid being cooked alive. These are real organisms, photographed, studied, categorized, thriving in conditions that would kill surface life in seconds. The creature had shown us ecosystems built on Earth's internal heat. We've now documented hundreds of vent sites across mid-ocean ridges worldwide, and every expedition finds new species with adaptations we're still working to understand. Next, the unexplored ocean. The statistic is repeated so often it's lost its impact, but it remains true. Over 80% of our ocean is unmapped, unobserved, unexplored. We have better topographic maps of Mars than of our own seafloor. The deepest portions of the ocean, the Hadal Zone trenches, have been visited by humans exactly 4 times. 4. In all of history. The Mariana Trench, deepest point on Earth, could swallow Mount Everest with over a mile to spare. We've spent cumulative hours there, not days, hours. When the creature communicated vast biological structures around thermal vents, organized colonies in the deep, I had no framework for that. Then I found research on cold seep ecosystems and whale falls. When a gray whale dies and sinks, its carcass becomes an oasis on the deep sea floor, supporting unique communities for decades. Entire species, zombie worms that dissolve bone with acid secretions, specialized crabs, bacterial mats, exist only on these isolated nutrient packages. Cold seeps, areas where hydrocarbons leak from the seafloor, create similar long-term ecosystems. Mussel beds covering hundreds of square meters. Tubeworm aggregations forming structures meters high. Ecosystems with defined zones and specialized niches that persist for centuries. Organized biological structures in the deep ocean aren't speculation, they're documented fact. The creature's communication about sound as a physical medium led me to acoustic research. The deep sound channel, also called the SOFAR channel, is a horizontal layer of water where temperature and pressure create a natural waveguide. Low-frequency sounds can travel thousands of miles through this channel with almost no energy loss. Whale populations separated by entire ocean basins can communicate. In 1997, NOAA detected an ultra-low-frequency sound they called the bloop. The profile matched a living creature, but the volume required something far larger than a blue whale, the largest animal we've ever confirmed. The sound was detected on sensors over 5,000 kilometers apart. Later analysis attributed it to ice quakes, but for years it remained an acoustic mystery from the deep ocean, a reminder of how little we actually monitor what's down there. We've recorded other unexplained sounds: the upsweep, the whistle, Julia, slow down. Most have been tentatively explained as geological or ice-related phenomena, but the explanations often come years later, and some remain genuinely unknown. The creature showed us a sonic web connecting vast portions of the ocean floor. We've since documented that sperm whales use distinct dialects across different family groups. Humpback whale songs change over time in patterns that spread across populations like cultural transmission. Dolphins use signature whistles that function as individual names, and they can remember and recognize specific whistles decades after last hearing them. Complex acoustic. Communication across hundreds or thousands of miles isn't fantasy. It's verified science we're only beginning to decode. Then there's deep-sea gigantism. The creature itself was roughly human-sized, but built for an environment where larger body size offers thermal advantages and where predation pressure favors different survival strategies than in shallow water. Giant squid reach lengths of 40 feet. Colossal squid have eyes the size of dinner plates, the largest in the animal kingdom, to capture what minimal bioluminescent light exists at depth. Japanese spider crabs span 12 feet across. Greenland sharks grow to 24 feet and may live over 400 years. The deep ocean produces organisms at scales we don't see in shallow ecosystems. The creature's size wasn't an anomaly. It was consistent with documented deep-sea biology. Finally, intelligence. The creature demonstrated awareness, intentional communication, and behavioral flexibility that suggested complex cognition. We have evidence for non-human intelligence in ocean ecosystems. Octopuses solve novel problems use tools, demonstrate individual personalities, and have distributed nervous systems with neurons throughout their arms. A fundamentally alien architecture for consciousness. Dolphins recognize themselves in mirrors, understand symbolic references, and demonstrate cultural transmission of learned behaviors. Great apes pass similar tests, and we don't question their intelligence. Sperm whales have the largest brains on Earth, with highly developed neocortex regions associated with complex cognition. Their click sequences show hierarchical structure similar to human language syntax. We've barely begun studying their communication because we lack the framework to understand intelligence that evolved in three-dimensional acoustic space rather than visual spatial landscape. If intelligence exists in the deep ocean, we likely wouldn't recognize it. Our tests assume visual communication, manipulative appendages, terrestrial problem-solving contexts. We're looking for minds like ours. The creature showed us a mind built on pressure, sound, and chemical gradients. Every major claim the creature communicated has a documented parallel in our own scientific literature. Sunless ecosystems powered by geothermal energy, vast unexplored regions with conditions we've barely sampled. Acoustic communication networks across thousands of miles, gigantic organisms adapted to crushing pressure and near freezing temperatures, the possibility of complex intelligence operating through sensory systems we don't possess. The only unprecedented element was the creature itself. Everything else was real. That's what made the experience so difficult to categorize. If we'd encountered something entirely outside known science, dismissal would be easier. Instead, we'd glimpsed something that fit perfectly into gaps we already knew existed. The abyss isn't empty. We've known that for decades. We just haven't looked closely enough to see what's actually there. I was a marine biologist for 11 years before this happened. I tell you that because I need you to understand something about how we're trained to think. We're taught to recognize intelligence in very specific ways. Tool use, social complexity, problem-solving that mimics our own cognitive patterns. We look for ourselves reflected back. The creature in the holding pool didn't use tools. It didn't solve puzzles. It didn't perform any of the behaviors we'd designed tests to measure, but it watched us with an intentionality that made my skin crawl. There's a study from 2019 on octopus cognition that haunts me now. Researchers discovered these animals can recognize individual human faces, remember which researchers fed them and which ones didn't, and actively plan revenge against the ones they disliked. They'd wait until that specific person walked by, then spray them with water through a gap in their tank lid. The intelligence was there. We just weren't looking for it in the right way. The creature observed us the way a scientist observes a specimen. Its eyes tracked our movements with systematic precision, left to right, head to toe, cataloging. When one of us would move, it wouldn't startle. It would simply shift its attention, recalibrate, continue the analysis. I kept thinking about cetacean research, how dolphins have names for each other, complex syntax in their communication, cultural knowledge passed down through generations, how humpback whales compose songs that evolve over years, spreading new patterns across entire ocean basins like musical evolution. We share 98% of our DNA with chimpanzees, and we still struggle to understand their social structures. This creature shared nothing with us. Different evolutionary path, different environmental pressures, different sensory reality. Its world was pressure and darkness and chemical gradients we can't perceive. Its body was built for an alien ecosystem that happens to exist on the same planet. How would we even begin to recognize what it considered important, what it valued, what it thought? The bioluminescent patterns rippling across its skin, we interpreted them as communication, because that's what cuttlefish do. But what if that wasn't language at all? What if it was something we don't even have a framework to understand? Emotional expression? Echolocation mapping made visible? Unconscious biological process? We were making the same mistake we always make. assuming intelligence looks like us. There's a concept in astrobiology about recognizing alien life, the shadow biosphere hypothesis, the idea that Earth might already host forms of life so biochemically different from us that we wouldn't recognize them as living at all. They'd be invisible to our detection methods because we're only looking for the signatures we know. The creature was right in front of us, tangible, undeniably alive, and I still don't know if we ever actually communicated with it or if we just convinced ourselves we did. One of the witnesses, the fisherman who'd first spotted it, claimed he received images, not words, not sounds, images that appeared in his mind, fully formed. The crushing pressure of the abyss, the thermal plumes of a hydrothermal vent, vast biological structures anchored to the ocean floor. I didn't experience that, neither did the others. Was he more receptive somehow, more sensitive to whatever method it used? Or was it psychosomatic, his brain constructing meaning from stress and fear and the desperation to understand? I don't know. What I do know is that every test we've designed for animal intelligence is fundamentally anthropocentric. We measure how well other species can navigate our cognitive landscape. We rarely ask if we're capable of navigating theirs. The creature never showed fear. That's what disturbed me most. Fear is universal in animals we understand. Prey, species, predators, everything in between. They all recognize threat and respond to it. Fight or flight, freeze, displacement behaviors. This creature showed none of that. It was confined, surrounded by beings it had never encountered, in an environment outside its natural habitat. By every measure, it should have been stressed. Instead, it observed. Either it didn't perceive us as a threat, which suggested an understanding of its own capabilities that should have terrified us, or it was operating on an emotional framework so foreign that our entire behavioral analysis toolkit was useless. I think about the deep ocean environment it came from, a place where bioluminescence is the primary communication method, where sound travels differently, where the concept of sky doesn't exist, where the pressure would crush a human body in seconds. That world would produce an intelligence shaped by completely different evolutionary pressures, different survival requirements, different social structures, if social structures existed at all. We were trying to communicate across not just a species barrier, but an environmental one, an experiential one. It would be like a surface-dwelling human trying to have a conversation with a consciousness that had never experienced light, never felt wind, never existed in anything but crushing darkness and cold. The question isn't whether the creature was intelligent. The question is whether we were intelligent enough to recognize what we were looking at. We kept it for 6 hours. Then someone made the decision to let it go. I don't remember who suggested it first. Maybe we all arrived at the same conclusion simultaneously. Maybe the weight of what we were doing finally became unbearable. We weren't equipped for this, not ethically, not scientifically, not psychologically. The fisherman who'd found it rigged a sling from his nets. We maneuvered it carefully, 4 of us supporting its weight, moving toward deeper water. It didn't resist, didn't thrash, just allowed itself to be carried, those black eyes tracking each of us in turn. When we lowered it into water deep enough to swim, it didn't bolt. It hung there, suspended, webbed appendages moving in slow, deliberate patterns. The bioluminescence beneath its skin pulsed once, a ripple of cold blue light that traveled from its head down the length of its body. Then it turned and looked at us. Not a glance, a look. I've spent years trying to articulate what I saw in that moment. There wasn't emotion there, not anything I recognized as emotion, but there was acknowledgement, recognition, something that said it understood exactly what had just happened. We had held something intelligent, examined it, confined it, and now we were releasing it because we'd finally grasped the enormity of what we'd done. It stayed there for maybe 30 seconds, just watching us. Then it rotated in the water with a single fluid motion and descended, not frantic, not fleeing, deliberate. I watched the pale glow of its skin fade as it dropped deeper, 10 feet, 20, 30, until the light was just a suggestion in the dark water and then nothing. I stood in the shallows until my legs went numb from the cold. None of us spoke on the walk back. What do you say after something like that? What words exist to process holding proof of something that shouldn't exist and then watching it disappear back into the ocean? The fisherman sold his boat 3 months later, moved inland. I heard through mutual acquaintances that he never went near the water again. The others scattered. One left the country. The rest of us stayed local, but stopped talking about it, stopped acknowledging it, built walls of silence around those 6 hours like we could contain them through sheer force of will. There was no evidence, no photographs. We'd been too stunned, too focused on the immediate reality of what we were dealing with. No tissue samples, no video. Nothing but 6 people with an identical, impossible memory. I tried to tell the story once, at a conference, framed it as a hypothetical. What if someone claimed to have encountered a humanoid aquatic species? How would we verify it? What protocol exists? The room laughed. Polite, academic laughter that said they thought I was making a rhetorical point about epistemology. I never brought it up again. The isolation is the hardest part. Not the ridicule. I expected that. But the fundamental loneliness of carrying an experience that restructured your entire understanding of reality and having no one to share that burden with. Because the others who were there, they carry it differently. We made an unspoken pact never to discuss it. Some experiences are too large to be reduced to conversation, too reality warping to be domesticated into anecdote. I go back to that beach sometimes. Stand at the waterline and look out at the miles of dark water. Wonder if it's still out there. Wonder if there are others. Wonder if it remembers us the way we remember it. Mostly, I wonder if it understood what we were. Did it recognize us as intelligent? Or were we just strange surface-dwelling creatures that briefly interrupted its journey? Did those 6 hours mean anything to it? Or was it simply a minor inconvenience in a lifespan we can't begin to estimate? I don't have answers, just questions that haven't faded in all the years since. And that final look, that moment of mutual recognition before it descended back into its world. I replay it constantly, the angle of its head, the way the light caught in those massive black eyes, the absolute stillness of its body as it held position in the current. It wasn't gratitude, it wasn't forgiveness, it wasn't anything human, but it was communication. I'm certain of that much. It was saying, I see you, I understand what you are, and I am choosing to return to a place you cannot follow. The ocean holds the memory of that encounter somewhere in its depths. The creature, if it still lives, carries our faces in whatever cognitive architecture exists behind those alien eyes. And we carry it. 6 people bound by an experience we can't prove, can't explain, and can't forget. The final look is the only evidence we have, and it's more than enough to ensure we'll never be the same. The ocean floor covers 71% of Earth's surface. We've mapped 5% of it. Think about that ratio. We possess detailed topographical data of Mars, Venus, even the far side of the Moon. We've photographed distant galaxies forming at the edge of observable space, but the majority of our own planet's surface remains as unknown to us as it was to our ancestors who believed the world was flat. The average depth of the ocean is 12,000 feet. Sunlight penetrates at most 3,000. Everything below that threshold exists in absolute darkness, a permanent night that has lasted since the formation of the seas themselves. And in that darkness, life found a way. Hydrothermal vents, discovered only in 1977, revealed entire ecosystems powered not by the sun, but by Earth's internal heat. Tube worms 8 feet long, eyeless crabs, bacterial colonies converting toxic chemicals into energy through processes we're still struggling to understand. These weren't remnants of some ancient world. They were thriving communities that had evolved in total isolation from everything we thought was necessary for life. The bloop was recorded in 1997, an ultra-low-frequency underwater sound detected across the Pacific Ocean. Its profile matched that of a living creature, something massive. For years it remained unexplained, later attributed to ice quakes, but the uncertainty lingered. The ocean is full of sounds we can't identify. Deep-sea gigantism produces creatures of nightmare scale. The giant squid reaches lengths of 40 feet. The colossal squid, larger still. The Greenland shark lives for 400 years, moving through darkness at depths where pressure would crush human bone. These aren't legends. They're documented species we only discovered because they occasionally surface, dead or dying. What remains down there, living at depths we cannot reach? The witnesses in this account described structures around vents, communities, an intelligence adapted to an environment so hostile to human life that we can only observe it through reinforced metal and thick glass, and only for hours at a time before our equipment fails. We think of Earth as known, cataloged, a solved problem, but we've barely looked. Whether the account you've heard today is literal truth or a compelling metaphor, it reveals something undeniable about the limits of human knowledge. We live on a planet whose greatest wilderness isn't a distant jungle or frozen desert. It's the abyss that begins just beyond the shore, a permanent darkness covering most of our world where pressure reaches 8 tons per square inch, where temperatures hover near freezing, and where life has had 4 billion years to evolve in directions we cannot predict. What other forms of intelligence could have developed down there, operating on principles we lack the capacity to recognize? What communities exist in trenches 7 miles deep, where no human has ever been? What watches us from below, as foreign to our understanding as we would be to it? Perhaps the real question isn't whether there are unknown creatures in the ocean depths. It's whether we're actually alone on the surface we think we dominate. The ocean keeps its secrets, and it's deep enough to hide anything.